Today, we look at the fourth Democratic debate. This took place on October 15th, 2019 in Westerville, Ohio, not more than 15 minutes from where I live. This has been by far the most interesting and substantive of the debates, and I have a lot of thoughts on this topic, so this video is going to be rather long. Well, you'll already know that because you'll see from the thumbnail how long it is. I don't know how long it will be yet, so it is more of a mystery to me as I record than it will be to you. What I'll do is rank all of these candidates from 12th to 1st in terms of how much they did to help themselves, in my opinion. As with any ranking, there is the possibility of error, but I am trying to account for their relative positions, their debate performance, and whether they were right or wrong about the claims that they made. So it is kind of a ranking system that is both arbitrary in the sense that I created it and I'm the only person contributing to it, but also hopefully fair. And if you're wondering how my analysis stacks up with mainstream press, go look up some of the reviews that they published in the early hours after the debates, and you will see that the only thing out there is complete and total shit. Therefore, you should support me. And this comes to the shilling part of the video. There's a way you can help me without spending any money. In my description, the third link down is to Brave browser. All you have to do is download this browser. It works the same as Firefox or Chrome, and then use that to do your searches. You don't have to necessarily make this your main browser. As long as you remain, quote, minimally active on the browser, I will receive $5 after 30 days. There are some benefits to this for you, however. It's a great browser. I actually do use it myself. And one thing it's really good at is that it seems to use less bandwidth than a lot of other browsers. So sometimes my Wi-Fi is a little tricky, and I can usually pick up a signal better on Brave than I can on Firefox or Chrome. Now that being said, there's a slight caveat if you use, say, official university websites or some things that are very sensitive. You will still have to use Chrome or Firefox for those purposes, but in general, you actually can use Brave as your primary browser, and it will work very well. There's also something you can earn on there. There are some kind of special points you can earn by looking at ads, and then you can donate the points you earn to creators you like. I have set up a wallet to receive those, but I don't really know how that works yet, so I can't say much more at this juncture. But thank you for considering downloading Brave and helping me out. So I'm going to assume all of you are downloading Brave with my link right now, and then you're going to continue watching this video. Let's get to the general impressions of this debate. As was the case with the first three debates, the rules of the road for this debate were set by a combination of the DNC, CNN, and the New York Times. Basically, the establishment writ large. Before the debate, if you actually watch the coverage, I listened to a few minutes of it. They had so-called experts like David Axelrod who came on and talked about the need for moderates to be on the ticket or candidates to moderate their message and appeal to a cross-section of voters. There was also some lady I'd never heard of before who was a former Clinton staffer who was talking about how Tulsi Gabbard was terrible and an Assad apologist. I've noticed that this is a talking point that all of the establishment media figures feel is necessary to work into any discussion of Tulsi. When I read some of the reviews of this debate online, every single one of them that mentioned Tulsi Gabbard put her in the loser category and then called her an Assad apologist. It's just become a boilerplate thing that gets worked into everything, and they made sure to say that before and after their coverage of the debate. So, in case you didn't get the memo, that is how you're supposed to think of Tulsi Gabbard. The general tenor of the debate is that Elizabeth Warren was forced to defend progressive ideas, and by giving her massively more time than Sanders, CNN was pushing the idea that she is the standard bearer of progressive ideas, and if you have any questions about any of them, she is the person who needs to answer for them. They're trying to treat Bernie as if he is irrelevant. So there is a very heavy anti-Bernie bias in that, but there was also a bit of an anti-Warren bias built into this because Warren was forced to fight by herself throughout the debate. as opposed to one of the previous debates where Warren and Sanders were working as a tag team. Warren would try to tag Sanders in this debate, but the moderators wouldn't allow it. Booker actually punted twice on substantive questions to talk about other stuff. That is not something I've ever seen before. I'm all for punting if the question is stupid. So if you're asked, say, for instance, who was your childhood hero, or who do you think the best rebounder on the Detroit Pistons is, you should punt and talk about something that people care about. But if you're asked about something that actually matters, you should try to answer the question to show that you have a grasp of an important issue. Booker punted twice on substance and saved all of his energy for high-flown rhetoric. What the fuck was he doing? I've never seen that before. Bold decision to say the least. I do have to say, while I have some critiques of this debate, such as the fact that climate change was never mentioned once by the moderators, the overall quality of the questions, the debate, and candidate preparation saw a dramatic improvement from the third debate, which was kind of a bit of an embarrassment. The middle of the debate was great in terms of substance and getting out differences and getting some back and forth going. I actually enjoyed watching this debate, unlike the last one. However, the beginning and the end were completely forgettable, largely because the questions being asked were rather dumb. Before we evaluate the candidates, I think it's only fair to evaluate the three moderators. CNN contributed Aaron Burnett and Anderson Cooper, and the New York Times had some guy I've never heard of and don't care about, who also didn't speak very much. His first name was Mark. Who cares what his last name was? The first and last questions were soft, to put it kindly. The first was on Trump's impeachment. There were no formal openers or introductions. And the last question was about who their most unlikely friend was. And then they worked in the story about Ellen attending a baseball game with George W. Bush. Or was it a football game? I don't even know. So these are dumb questions, and what this does, I think, is allow CNN to get away with not allowing the lesser-known candidates to introduce themselves and make a case for themselves in a succinct fashion. So you're a lot less likely as a random CNN viewer to know who Andrew Yang or Tulsi Gabbard is than you are, say, Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren, people who are much more liked by CNN. So by making the intro and exit of the debates untraditional, what CNN did effectively was hurt the ability of lesser-known candidates to introduce themselves. They also took an attack from Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard went directly after them for their smears of her, which I thought was excellent. And they actually took that attack with mostly good grace. They did show some very heavy anti-Tulsi bias, but I think they would have done that anyway. They were already on course to do that anyway. So in comparative terms, considering how poorly they treat her all the time, this was somewhat gracious of them, which makes me want to vomit in my mouth while I'm saying it because it sounds like I'm giving them praise and I'm not. One cutoff of Tulsi was especially noticeable, and others have already noted this, at least on the progressive left. There was a really stupid question about age, which literally came up just to talk about how Bernie had a heart attack. And they only asked the other two septuagenarians on the stage the question, then they asked Tulsi something random, and she said, well, it's only fair to talk about everyone's age and health since you asked those three, but what I'd like to talk about is how prepared someone is to be commander-in-chief. And then she tried to reflect the question back on Elizabeth Warren, because this is something that Tulsi's been talking about the last few weeks, that she doesn't think Warren is qualified to be commander-in-chief. But Warren didn't have to answer that question because Aaron Burnett cut Tulsi off and went to break, and the question was not raised again. Anderson Cooper, when he introduced Joe Biden and asked him a question about corruption, emphasized very strongly that neither Joe Biden nor Hunter Biden was guilty of any corruption. So he shut off any possibility of debate about that issue. Now, Cory Booker, who might be mildly retarded, actually jumped in and defended Joe Biden's honor, saying that the media, especially the people who were asking questions were being deeply disrespectful of this great American statesman by implying that he was corrupt. I have no idea how he got that impression, and I don't think he understands the meaning of words that people around him use. Again, something seriously wrong with Cory Booker. Like, the dude is not all here. He's not smart enough to be running for president. Full stop. In terms of coverage of people on the stage and screen time, Bernie, Biden, and Yang got too little time, if you look at where they're at in the polls. I was actually surprised that Biden got as little time as he did, given that he is a media darling. But then I thought about it, and the truth is that the more time he gets, the worse off he is. If you take him in relatively limited doses, he actually does a lot better. And I think that he performed a lot better tonight than in previous debates, simply because he was on screen less. As for Bernie Sanders, the amount of screen time that he got was absolutely shameful, and there's no way that he had as much or more screen time when compared to Amy Klobuchar and Cory Booker, both of whom are irrelevant and have no chance of winning the nomination. Klobuchar, Buttigieg, and Booker got a lot of screen time, yet none of them are polling particularly well. I could see possibly justifying putting Buttigieg on the screen, but Klobuchar got a lot of time for her 1% of the vote or 2% or whatever she has. As I mentioned, there was also a candidate health question which was manufactured just so Erin Burnett could say the words, "Bernie Sanders, you had a heart attack. Are you okay?" And she said it 2 or 3 times, by the way. And then they asked Biden a question like, if you get elected, you'll be over 80 in office. Jimmy Carter said something about being old. Biden just said, well, I'm very experienced, and experience is important. They asked something of Warren because she's over 70, and she just said she has a bunch of energy. They let that go. Really inappropriate question, I think. Not very balanced, since it was literally clearly directed at just one person. So another instance of CNN really hating Bernie Sanders. They also did a somewhat okay-ish job of encouraging conflict between candidates in a somewhat balanced way. The problem is the dynamic was formed by the candidates themselves, because all of them, with the exception of Bernie and Yang, were trying their best to attack Elizabeth Warren. So the dynamic was very much a screw the leader dynamic, like you would see in a poorly designed board game. So I think the moderators sucked, but the debate itself was good despite them. As we'll see, there are a few very solid candidates for both the overall winner and biggest loser of the night. First, of course, we're starting with the losers, as always, and in my opinion, the worst performance of the night goes to Kamala Harris, who needed a decent night. She has been falling away for the last couple months. Her poll numbers continue to decline. Her credibility continues to erode. And tonight will definitely hurt her if people were paying attention. She said a lot of dumb shit in this debate. At the outset, they were asked a question about impeachment, and Kamala Harris, who reminds us at every opportunity that she's a former prosecutor, claimed that impeachment will be very easy. I have no idea what she's smoking. That impeachment is never easy. It's always a partisan thing which will be fought tooth and nail. The idea that impeaching Trump will magically remove him from office in the next 48 hours or whatever fantasy people who actually believe what she says may have in their heads is just fantasy at best. She said a couple things that were decent. She said we should jail pharma executives who created the opioid crisis. Of course, she won't actually do that, but she was trying to play the tough prosecutor role again, so she had to talk about putting people in jail because that's sort of her thing. She deflected from the wealth tax question to talk about tax credits. I don't know what she was talking about, really. It sounded kind of boring, and it didn't sound all that substantive. It sounded like a way for her to avoid attacking the people who she wants to get money from. And as I mentioned, she reminded us ad nauseum about her past as a prosecutor. I think she might have said this literally 5 times, maybe 6. So almost every time she spoke. She did speak with confidence, however. She spoke of what she would do in her administration And when she talked about what a president had to do, she talked about the president using female pronouns. There may very well be a female president, but it's not going to be Kamala. She said of Donald Trump in reference to one of the questions, I believe it was the Syria question where she didn't have much of an answer, that dude gotta go. No one laughed. She also, during the tech monopoly question, showed her colors as a corporatist by not talking about this issue of tech monopolies at all, but instead interrupting to challenge Warren to have the courage to ban Donald Trump from Twitter. I shit you not. And I think that actually has to take the cake for being the dumbest thing anyone said all night. As if breaking up tech monopolies is a boring, meaningless step, whereas true courage is having the courage to deprive someone else of their right to free speech, and to deprive the American people of their right to follow the president of the country and whatever he wants to say. I mean, insanity. Pure insanity. And that literally, like I said, easily the dumbest thing of the night, possibly of this entire debate cycle. Although her performance overall was not as bad as, say, some past performances I've seen in the cycle, but that line was pretty far up there in terms of being just awful. She also had aggressive verbal fry going on all night. A thing like Valley Girls do. She was trying to do the Valley Girl thing a little bit. I think she's maybe trying to play a little bit of blue state identity politics by emphasizing her California sound. I don't know what was going on, but her verbal fry was way worse than normal. I've also heard in the Midwest, I live near where this debate took place in Columbus, and verbal fry in the Midwest is also a thing with women. So it might have been some sort of weird attempt at Midwestern identity politics. I don't know what was going on, but it definitely is not how she normally talks. Oh, also, one of her qualifications for being president is that she is Blasian. So that's one of her new resume lines. Her mom, of course, was from India, and her father is black. Therefore, she's Blasian, and that gives her unique insight because of something or other. Who knows? Next up is someone who routinely finishes near the bottom of debates when it comes to his performance because he is an idiot. I'm talking, of course, about the corporate hooker, Cory Booker. He had a couple of things that he said that I found surprising. He actually is in favor of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and he wants to create more unionized work by encouraging union formation and allowing even fast food workers to form unions. While this is not a radical stance within the Democratic Party, it's not really something I've heard Cory Booker talk very much about, and I think that shows how progressive the discourse has become due to the efforts of Bernie Sanders and his supporters. When he talked about impeachment, he said that it's a moral issue that should be unifying. Could impeachment be a moral issue? Sure. Is it going to be unifying? By definition, no. There's no way it could ever be unifying. How could one party pushing for the removal of another party's president bring everyone in the country together? That's incredibly idiotic. Yet, this was basically a central message. He doesn't push it as hard as Buttigieg did in this debate, but he wants to bring people together and be harmonious and whatnot. On the wealth tax issue, he somewhat waffled on it to say that no one had addressed the issue of child poverty. The problem with that is that, of course, he's not known for fighting poverty, one, but two, he spoke directly after Elizabeth Warren, who literally said that part of her reason for wanting to do the wealth tax is to use the money generated by it to provide things for children, and she listed specific programs which would really help poor children especially. So his timing on that was completely off. And again, he looked like someone who wasn't paying attention and was out to lunch. On the issue of automation, which was actually a whole heading of this debate, CNN actually brought this up to their credit, I guess because here in Ohio there have been a lot of jobs lost due to outsourcing and automation. Booker chose to punt the question to defend Biden from attacks by Trump over corruption, and then said something about Planned Parenthood. So if you want to win in the Midwest, or you want to win in general outside of blue states, you have to talk about economics. And Booker routinely avoids these questions like the plague. That's why I found it so shocking when several minutes or maybe half an hour later he talked about raising the minimum wage and unions, because that is not Booker's norm. Booker's norm is punting on a question about automation because he doesn't give a shit about job loss, and then talking about Joe Biden's honor. That's really way more in line with Booker. When it came to the issues of Trump and children and Russia and guns, he had a lot of rhetoric. It was flowery, it sounded nice, but it really just sounded like someone doing an impression of Obama with minimal effort, where you want the sound to be right, but you don't include any substance. He had a strong answer on abortion, but he had a dumb idea about creating some office in the executive branch to make sure that women have the right to choose, which doesn't make sense at all. I don't understand why you need a specific office of the government, an executive agency, to enforce pro-choice. That doesn't make sense at all to me. He said that he's a vegan maybe 3 or 4 times, not as many times as Kamala said she was a former prosecutor, but a lot. And I just want you all to know that Cory Booker is a vegan, and you should not forget that. It makes him a better person than you, unless you're also a vegan. So just so you know, that's where you stand, and you should be aware of that. He had well-rehearsed rhetoric at the beginning and end, so the soft questions, or frankly the questions designed to appeal to dumb people and hurt the lesser-known candidates, he was really good on those. Not surprisingly, considering that those were not the substantive questions, and he didn't have to respond in a way that was detailed or informed. He could just use some well-rehearsed rhetoric. He delivered his stuff well, but he didn't actually say anything. He also engaged in tone policing at one point, thus taking up Pete Buttigieg's sash as hall monitor that he dropped after the last debate. So Booker, pretty terrible performance. I thought about putting him last, but I decided that Kamala was just a little bit worse. Going into this debate, I did not think that Pete Buttigieg would really rock the boat. I thought he was going to keep playing the long game and hoping for something to happen more organically. However, he took me by surprise by going on the offensive. He had given a few indications of this through his messaging earlier, but I didn't think he was going to go all in on the strategy. He effectively, though, became one of the primary attackers from the center against the left. So he is taking up the highly successful John Hickenlooper playbook. So at least we know that Pete Buttigieg is politically brilliant, since he chose a great model to mimic. His central message during this debate is in line with what he said previously. Polarization is bad, and we need to think about the morning after Trump. Everything needs to be polite except me when I'm talking to Elizabeth Warren. That was basically his message. Medicare for all, therefore, is bad, not only because it's expensive, but it's also polarizing. I mean, people have strong feelings on that, so we shouldn't be for something that causes polarized feelings. That's not cool. He mentioned that his dad drove a Chevy Cavalier and that he personally drives a Chevy Cruze. The reason is because there's a GM plant in Ohio that laid off a bunch of workers. So he is showing solidarity with those workers by sucking up to them by pretending that Chevy makes decent cars. Beto also mentioned the Chevy Impala at one point, but at least it emerged slightly more organically. Pete Buttigieg was straight up pandering, and it was pretty gross. He played Midwestern identity politics to the hilt. He kept mentioning over and over and over that he is from Indiana. At one point, I think he forgot where he was because he mentioned that he's from the Midwest as if it were some distant land, when he's actually in the heart of the heartland in central Ohio. He got nasty with Beto on guns at one point, and it was odd to me that two guys who were trying to run as the nice young dude got into a little tiff over guns. Basically what Buttigieg was trying to do was to expose that Beto is a little dumb, so he called Beto's plan a shiny object, And also when Beto said we need to be courageous, Pete snapped at him and said that he doesn't need a lesson on courage from Beto. So that might be damning under different circumstances for Beto, but in the exchange, Beto came off as passionate, whereas Pete came off as vengeful, rude, and just not pleasant. Normally his appeal is limited insofar as he comes off as pleasant because he doesn't really have any good ideas. So when he comes off as aggressive, that really diminishes the appeal that he might otherwise have. I think he did himself some damage by coming off so prickly. He had a somewhat interesting but vague take on the Supreme Court. He was asked about his court packing scheme. He did not explain it very well, but he did at least highlight the problem of how the Supreme Court is politicized and needs to be reformed in some way. I think the people who followed him had better ideas on this, and he didn't even take a firm stand. He just said, I don't know, maybe 5 people should be appointed by the other 10, or we should have some sort of rotation system, but we got to do something. So he's on the right track, but he kind of needs to nail down what he wants to do before he starts talking about this. Otherwise, he just sounds like he's spitballing, and that's not good. He was also allowed to take the tone on the withdrawal from Syria issue because CNN moderators liked his stance. He basically said we need to be there, and Trump made a mistake, that Trump betrayed our allies, and that he undermined the honor of our troops, and that it would be hard to look civilians in the eye anymore. And then he also talked about Trump's untrustworthiness, and he effectively tried to cut off Tulsi Gabbard, who made an opposite point. Because of the way that other candidates didn't disagree with Buttigieg and sort of low-key agreed, and everybody ignored what Tulsi had said, he kind of looked good in that exchange if you didn't know what was going on and you don't know the substance of the issues. If you do, then he wasn't really making too many good points there. And even though this was the best part of the debate for him, I don't think it offsets the other shit that was there. He, in my opinion, is a strong contender for being the worst in the field when it comes to how well he performed tonight. But because he at least looked good from an artificial standpoint at one point in the debate, I can't put him dead last. Although I do have to confess, he irked me to no end, and I was unhappy every time he's on the screen. I had been drinking some, and I may or may not have yelled at the TV every time he appeared. If Pete Buttigieg became the new John Hickenlooper, then Amy Klobuchar decided to one-up him and go with the even less pleasant version of that strategy, the John Delaney strategy, of just being abrasive and abusive to people you disagree with and calling all of their proposals pie in the sky and just hammering them relentlessly and talking down to them in a way that was deeply disrespectful. Klobuchar was very aggressive. She was rude, she was abrasive, and her bullying tendencies that we know so well from the way that she's treated her staffers were on full display. However, she did dominate the flow of this debate, and CNN gave her an excessive amount of screen time. She had as much screen time as someone who actually matters, and probably more than Bernie Sanders, who is actually someone who has a chance to win. On the Syria issue, she punted just to talk about how bad Trump is because she doesn't actually have a foreign policy. That, I think, is pretty damning. Especially since she always talks about how bad everyone else's plans are and never really talks about her own. So because she already has some weakness on the domestic front, punting on a question and then just saying Trump is bad makes her look incredibly uninformed and unqualified when it comes to foreign policy. One positive thing that she said is that Big Pharma should pay for the treatment of victims of the opioid epidemic, and she said something to the effect of her father used to drink, and now he's sober, and everyone deserves to be touched by grace, whatever that means. So she had a little bit of a personal moment that would have worked better if her performance had been more in line with her, hey, I'm just the boring alternative to the progressives in the field, and I'm here, yay. But since she was so nasty in other parts of the debate, I don't think it worked. In her conversation on the wealth tax, she gave Elizabeth Warren what she termed a reality check, and then said, all you need to do is just repeal the Trump tax cuts and you'll have all the revenue you need to fund the government. Which, by the way, is not exactly true. Even before the Trump tax cuts, we already had some revenue issues because of the pre-existing Bush tax cuts, which Obama made permanent. The Trump tax cuts merely exacerbated the existing issue. That being said, what Klobuchar was trying to do is appear to be more informed than these radical progressives, and also to not take a stance on the wealth tax so as not to alienate rich people who might give her money. On the issue of the tech monopolies, she tried to argue that everyone else had it wrong, and that this issue is not an issue of government intervention, but rather a pro-competition issue, and that the founding fathers were all in favor of competition. I have no idea what she was talking about there. The founding fathers did not have to deal with monopolies. That wasn't a thing yet. Almost all industry such as it existed was localized, and the concept of a monopoly didn't emerge until the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century. So whatever the founding fathers might have said about that was not from experience, but maybe just from speculation. And I seriously doubt that Amy Klobuchar could name a single founding father who said anything about monopolies unless she had access to her full research staff in Congress. One other thing that she did was try to head off Warren's attack about using Republican talking points that she used on Delaney. She said, I'm not using Republican talking points. I'm sick of people saying that. I'm just, you're the one creating Republican talking points with these terrible left-wing policies. I'm just the moderate, cool person in the race. And she said all this in a cringeworthy and awful whining voice. She sounded like she was on the verge of tears, just talking about how people were accusing her of being a Republican, even though no one on the stage called her that during the debate. And she said several times that just because she disagrees with Warren doesn't mean that her ideas aren't just as bold. But her ideas aren't bold. Her ideas barely exist. But she's trying to pretend like it's some sort of bigotry ideologically to pretend that her ideas just aren't as bold, when in reality she has no bold positions whatsoever. And calling any of her positions bold just to be kind to her, kind to moderates, ignores what a bold proposal is. A bold proposal actually has to stand for something. Klobuchar stands for nothing. And of course, she's from Minnesota, so she engaged in some Midwestern identity politics too, although hers were not quite as cringy as Pete's. Of all the people on the stage, she irritated me the most, even more than Pete, and I screamed at the TV every single time she opened her mouth, which was a lot since she was on screen way too often. So again, she was the John Delaney 2.0. I don't know if she's the new and improved model, or she was just a lateral move from Delaney. I'm going to go with the lateral move, which of course is saying a lot. But let's move on to someone better than Amy Klobuchar. Now we transition to Andrew Yang, and we transition away from the category I consider to be clear losers to the category I consider to be middling. Andrew Yang was pretty weak, but he didn't implode or anything like that. He had a solid opener, and he did a good job of pivoting away from impeachment to talk about economic conditions which put Trump in the White House. So core issues that people care about rather than a congressional procedure which has almost no chance of success. Like I said, anytime you have a chance to pivot away from a dumb question to talk about things that matter, you should do it. So Yang had a strong beginning. He talked about the UBI, as he always does, and he put it in opposition to Bernie Sanders' federal jobs guarantee, characterizing the UBI as trickle up. And he said that the FJG is bad because no one wants to work for the federal government. That is a talking point he's been using on the trail. And unfortunately, because Bernie and Yang did not get much speaking time, Bernie got no chance to respond to that. I'm actually very curious what Bernie's response to that would be, but I guess we'll probably never know, since the moderators didn't think it was worthwhile. They wanted to talk more about Amy Klobuchar's view of the world. He spoke about the danger of automation. He was not the only person, of course. CNN made that a main topic, but by making automation and the UBI a relatively major issue, at least in this debate, I think that he has shown that he's had an impact on the race as a whole, and that's a good sign for him. He talked about the experience of truckers, and at one point he also talked about meeting an individual trucker who used to be a Trump supporter and how he won this person over. That was all pretty solid. He talked about how he's against the wealth tax, however, and he said it's a bad idea because it's too hard to implement, as some countries in Europe have shown, and that it won't yield much, and therefore we should use a VAT, a value-added tax. I think he's wrong on this issue, and I don't think that his rhetoric was very convincing during the debate. Also, I don't think he's considering that we have a lot more billionaires than a lot of the European countries who have tried to implement this, and that therefore we could yield a lot more income. As for the value-added tax, it is somewhat regressive. It's not as bad as the normal sales tax, but it effectively does tax online activities. So therefore it would be paid by everyone, including people who don't make that much money. And anytime you have a sales tax of any variety, what that means is that it is inherently regressive because it impacts people more who have less money to begin with. When he was talking about Putin and the issue of Russia, the question wasn't super clear, and his answer was also not clear at all. His answer on Putin was rambling. He talked about the hacking of democracy, and then he listed a bunch of things. It was just kind of a big list with keywords, and it wasn't terribly coherent. Yang is usually very coherent, so that was definitely a standout bad answer from him. He is also against breaking up big tech companies, and he says that it is a 20th century solution for a 21st century problem, which I guess was an attack on Warren, who wants to break that up. Maybe it was an attack on Bernie. He didn't call out Bernie or Warren by name. I don't know. And he said that the focus needs to be on protecting our data, since it should be our property and we should be getting the money for it. I'm not sure how much that will resonate outside of the people who are already Yang supporters, and that's why I think he broke even. If you already support Yang and his ideas, you probably like what you heard. If you're not on the Yang, if you're not a member of the Yang gang, you probably didn't give a shit. So he broke even. Some people have tried to paint him as a winner, but I don't see it. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Tulsi Gabbard has already been declared a loser by pretty much every mainstream outlet, and they also worked in one or sometimes two references to her being an Assad apologist. So I will just tell you what I saw on the stage. What I think is that Tulsi's performance will depend entirely on what you think about her going into the debate. What you'll see will probably not change your mind. If you don't like her, you're not going to like her. If you already like her, you'll still like her. If you're indifferent, you will remain indifferent. And therefore, I think that because her performance had some highlights and some lowlights, some of the lowlights being caused by media bias against her, that she really didn't impact her race at all. She probably needed a breakout moment tonight, and she didn't get it, so you could argue that she's a loser of the debate. However, because she did have some good points, and there's some possibility that a few of the things that she said might have gotten through to a couple people, I can't put her in a loser category. I see her as sort of finishing around the middle of the pack. One thing that surprised me was during the automation debate where she backed the UBI. I had no idea she was in favor of that. Must be a new position. She also said that she sees trade deals as a problem for job loss, and she said that she's against the federal jobs guarantee. Since CNN did its utmost to not allow her to speak, we never got any elaboration of that, and we also had no exchange between Bernie and Tulsi over that issue. She said at one point that part of her reason for being against the federal jobs guarantee is that self-value comes from within, not from having a job. Apparently, she has never talked to men about how they view their jobs, because for men, a lot of self-worth does come from jobs, and there is a ton of research that backs that up. So she was more or less objectively wrong about that, although it didn't sound that terrible when she said it. She took a strong stand against being involved in Syria in the first place, which was great, but then no one supported her, and that created an optical problem. So she struck out a bold position on that war, saying that we should not have gone in, and that we were right to leave, and that it's okay that Trump withdrew. I actually think that she's correct on the issue. The problem is that the optics of what happened next are not great, because she was then attacked by Pete Buttigieg and the other candidates, including Bernie, unfortunately. When they answered the question, they did not support what she said. They didn't necessarily go after her or anything like that, but by not backing her and by mirroring some of what Buttigieg said, they effectively endorsed his position. And that made her look like she was out on an island and that she was some sort of wacko. And of course, after the debate, the moderators would probably go on air and then tell you again that she's some sort of Assad apologist and shouldn't be taken seriously. Her best moment, though, was not when she was talking about the Yemen war that Saudi Arabia is waging, something that a couple other people mentioned after her, but when she called out CNN and the New York Times directly for smearing her. They wrote that she was a Russian asset and an Assad apologist, and she called them out to their faces. This is another reason why I think that a few people who may have been a little on the fence about her may have thought about reconsidering her after hearing that. So that was a strong moment for her. I'm glad that she finally stood up to them for smearing her rather than just allowing that to go unanswered. Now, I know that she struck back on social media and other places, but to do so on national television is very good. On the candidate health question, she did call out how unfair the question was since it was only directed to the old candidates, but then she tried to redirect it into fitness to be commander-in-chief, and then she asked Warren directly if she was qualified to be the commander-in-chief, but Aaron Burnett went to break and did not require Warren to answer the question. For the most part, Warren did take a lot of attacks, but she was spared that one, which may have actually been the hardest attack she would have faced had it gone through. I'm not sure how that obvious interruption would play with people watching, especially people who aren't super high information. Maybe they would think that the media was right to shield Warren from such a disrespectful question. I don't know. But I think that for other people, this would be something that might be powerful. She had a solid answer to the last question about who are some people you've been friends with who were not likely friendships. And she did pretty well with the question as it was, which is surprising given what a poor question it is. But she probably would have been better served to pivot away from that and talk about other topics she didn't get to talk about to show that she has a breadth to her agenda which goes beyond being against endless wars. Or she could have circled back to the point about endless wars and called out her opponents as corporatist warmongers or something like that. She should have made a point that would resonate with voters and talk about what she'll do as president. She needs a big breakout moment, and she had that opportunity at the end to pivot and try to go for it, and she missed her opportunity there. So she finished about in the middle of the pack, in my opinion at least. The last candidate who I have as treading water without advancing or regressing is Beto O'Rourke. He was not a better debater necessarily than Yang or Tulsi. However, the standard is much lower for him because there's no one in the media gunning for him. He doesn't get ignored, and he has already proved that he can attract some voters despite being a terrible debater and having no substance. So for him to produce substance is a luxury and not a requirement. Also, as I've mentioned in the past, I think he's running a vice presidential campaign, so he doesn't need to really be that good. His impeachment answer was a messy list of buzzwords. It was a real word salad. I couldn't make heads or tails of what he was trying to say, and I thought that he was going to be in for a rough night, but then he turned things around some. He said that the key to saving jobs is to make sure that labor standards apply to all of our trade partners. He used the instance of workers in Mexico being allowed to unionize. That would then drive up their wages and create less of a race to the bottom. That's actually not a bad idea, and it could also be a part of a broader foreign policy in theory. He said something about needing free college or cheap college. I didn't catch the exact wording he used. I don't know if that's him trying to pivot to be for free college or whether he was spitballing. He also talked about needing, was it 5 million apprenticeships over the next 8 years? So he's talking about, skilled labor jobs and sort of high-paid blue-collar jobs. something that we always are in need of. So it was a little incoherent in the middle when he's talking about the college part, but the answer itself was different than what some of the other people were talking about. So he didn't answer the automation question directly, but he still managed to come up with a solid enough answer. He hit Warren for being too punitive in her policies toward the rich when it came to the wealth tax. And because of the screw the leader dynamic, Beto did not say Bernie and Warren and Bernie. I think that a lot of the establishment Democrats didn't say and Bernie because then CNN might feel compelled to call on him and he would drop a much harder elbow than what Warren was throwing out. But she said that she had a good response to that, so that attack didn't really stick too well. It was kind of dumb, and it was Beto's one attempt to strike Warren. His other fighting was with Pete Buttigieg, and we've already talked about that. Buttigieg was the aggressor, but Beto won simply by coming across as being the person with more of an idea of what to do and the person who had more courage. On the issue of Russia and freezing Putin's assets, or whatever weird question it was, he said that we need diplomacy and we need to utilize the power of inspiration. This answer, of course, the second part is kind of dumb, but he didn't totally faceplant. And when you're dealing with difficult issues like foreign policy, the bar for Beto is not very high, so the answer was good enough. When he was going after Buttigieg, or at least hitting back, I wouldn't say going after since Buttigieg started the fight, he hit Pete's answer for being too poll-tested and tepid. He didn't say the word tepid, but that's what he meant. And I think that he made Buttigieg look pretty weak in that instance. And I was surprised how well Beto defended himself, especially when we consider a couple debates ago he got attacked by Julián Castro, and Beto just looked like he was about to melt through the floor of the stage. He did not look at all strong. He did work in one quick Chevy reference in the last instance when they asked about a surprising friendship. He's talking about taking a road trip with some Republican to get to D.C., and they rented a Chevy Impala. Overall, he came across mostly as pleasant. He was much more eloquent than normal. His vocabulary was actually solid. So in relative terms, he did pretty well. He maintained the high performance that he had last time, and I think that he has restored a lot of his credibility, although I think that his chances of winning the nomination are still pretty much non-existent. The person who straddles the line between treading water and swimming is Joe Biden, which is ironic because he, of course, is a former lifeguard who once fought a man with a knife using a pull chain. That, of course, being Corn Pop, who was not mentioned in this debate for whatever reason. Biden had relatively little speaking time given his standing in the polls, and like I said, I think that was a deliberate decision by CNN to protect him from himself, and it was probably a wise precaution since they're trying to push Joe Biden. Biden did have some gaffes. He said a few things that made me really have to turn my head. In general, he wasn't super eloquent. There were plenty of times where he said things that weren't quite right, but he, for the most part, was coherent, and he came across as mostly strong and as someone who could be a viable candidate. His worst moment was when he had been making all kinds of outlandish claims about all the great things he had accomplished, and then Bernie Sanders finally clapped back, the only person to attack him throughout the whole debate, by the way. And Bernie said, yes, you have gotten some things done with Republicans, and he listed about 3 or 4 major pieces of legislation that were terrible, including the invasion of Iraq that Biden helped bring about through his bipartisan actions. So Biden actually did take the single hardest attack of the night, the sickest burn, if you will, but he kept going. He didn't seem to notice that Bernie had attacked him, and for the most part, Biden came across pretty well by his standards. And just like with Beto, the standards are a lot lower for Biden than they are with other candidates, although he has been losing support over time, and he did need to turn things around. One way to do that is just to look stable and to talk about your electability and also all the things you've done. Don't talk about your advanced age, instead talk about your experience. He was able to do all of those things. He made all of his experience sound positive. He talked about his electability. He was able to get that in there a couple times. Those polls that show that he beat Trump are one of the few things he has going for him, if we're being honest. And he talks about having a record of getting things done. Now, this was deeply problematic because he's taking credit for a lot of things that other people did, and he was basically stealing valor legislatively. He tried to take credit for beating Bork. I don't know how much of a role Joe Biden had in the Bork nomination fight. He says that he was basically the primary backer of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Elena Kagan. He even tried to claim that Kagan was one of his staffers or something at one point. I don't know. And he just kept trying to claim basically everything good that's ever happened since 1900 was Joe Biden's manufacture. It was completely absurd, and I was flabbergasted at the boldness of it, but there was very little pushback, and he had no incentive not to keep doing it, so he did. And I think that for a lot of voters who are on the fence, who may have been considering abandoning him, he may have said enough to make them stay. For a couple people who may have soft abandoned him and were looking for another candidate, people who in other words had not found another candidate but were resolved to jump ship, this might be enough to keep them on board. I don't think his performance was strong enough to win over any converts, but this will keep him alive for a while longer, and it may renew the confidence of some of his donors who have become worried. He didn't come across, to put it frankly, as someone who had dementia, so that's what he really needed to do. He had one heated exchange with Warren over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he was basically trying to take credit for that too, because Warren pushed back on the idea that no one else had really gotten anything done by claiming that, and then he said, well, I got all the votes for it in the Senate. And Warren, I think, had a pretty sick burn at Biden's expense, although it was a little subtle. She said, yes, I think President Obama and all the people who voted for it. So, pretty good burn. I feel like Bernie's burn on him was better by talking about, the shit legislation that he's got done in the name of bipartisanship. But Biden, despite taking a couple of hits, mostly looked pretty good here. And it pains me to say that. I was hoping that he would come out and talk about corn pop or the phonograph again, but he actually had a good night. Maybe he had taken some ginseng before the debate. I don't know. Anyway, I would put him in the very slight winner category for tonight. In the next category, we have people who clearly gained something from the debate or did what they set out to accomplish. Of the winners, I think that Bernie Sanders won the least. A lot of the articles I've read actually name him as the winner. I wish I could agree. The reason why I can't put him higher is because he didn't get enough screen time to really make his points, and since he was asked objectively harder questions than the other candidates, he was not able to demonstrate the full range of his thinking. He also didn't get to speak on a whole lot of key issues. So what CNN effectively did was only ask these issues to Warren, who they basically made the standard bearer for all things progressive, and Bernie kind of was forced to look like an also-ran who didn't have a full plethora of issues. On the question of impeachment, Bernie focused on the emoluments clause and said that that's how you would convict Trump and get him out of office. Bernie's 100% right on this issue. If you actually are serious about getting rid of Trump, you have to go the emoluments route, because that is an actual well-defined crime, whereas a lot of this dealing with foreign government stuff may not even be illegal, would be very difficult to prove, and would come off as very partisan and not have a strong legal basis behind it. In terms of Medicare for All, Bernie was not really asked to defend it in terms of the expenditure, since they kind of laid it out like, oh yeah, Bernie says we got to raise taxes. That's his stance. He instead mostly focused on the benefits of Medicare for All, and then questioned why there were so many Democrats defending a broken system and a greedy industry, which I thought was a powerful moment for him. He also talked about how most of the taxes that would be raised to pay for Medicare for All would be paid by the wealthy. So this would not be a major concern for the average person. He didn't get to say all that much on Medicare for All, but this is his signature issue, and what he said was powerful and effective. He had great stuff on the federal jobs guarantee and on the wealth tax. Yang, of course, said he was against the federal jobs guarantee and said that one line about no one wants to work for the federal government. Unfortunately, there was no chance for the two of them to debate the merits of the federal jobs guarantee versus the UBI. That's what I wanted to see. It didn't happen. Hopefully in the future this will happen. Maybe they'll do it over social media or something like that. He got a harder sub-variety of the Syria question, where another wrinkle was added in as to whether we should consider Turkey an ally at this juncture after their actions. So he was set up to answer a much more difficult question than anyone else was asked to answer. And because he had to answer a much harder question and his time limits were being strictly enforced, his answer was mediocre. In order to try to address the issue of Turkey and their right or wrong conduct, he had to effectively leave Tulsi hanging and didn't get to talk about his stance against endless wars or to defend her in some way. So I think that by doing that, what Aaron Burnett, who clearly is a corporate hack, did is to simultaneously damage Bernie and Tulsi by creating a harder question for Bernie to answer, whereas everybody else got a much more open question where they could simply repeat some line that they had memorized. One thing that he did well is that when Aaron was about to ask him about his health, he quickly pivoted and wanted to get in on the action on the question of the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and the opioid epidemic. Bernie is someone who campaigns very strongly in the Rust Belt, where this issue is very prevalent, and this is something that he has been a leader on. So he did well to pivot away from a dumb question and talk about something that matters. And he brought up the problem of unfettered capitalism, since the pharmaceutical executives did say in memos that, yeah, we're going to keep pumping out these drugs. People are consuming them a lot. We're making a lot of money. Addiction is great. And he talked about that being a result of unfettered capitalism, and he tried to work that back into his overall message of needing a political revolution to get things back on the right track. When it came to the health question, which Aaron Burnett, of course, did not let go, because she had to say out loud, Bernie Sanders, you recently had a heart attack and you are 78 years old. So you're old and you're going to die. So she had to work that in, of course. But Bernie had, I think, a pretty good question, which was a little cheeky, but in a fun way. He said, if you have any questions about my health, watch me campaign. You will see that I am vigorous and that I am going to do well. He also, in general, seemed healthy tonight. He looked great. He sounded good. He was energetic. He was on point. He had a few good moments with Biden, when Biden one time gestured at him when he said the word Putin, and then Bernie said, "Sir, I'm Vladimir Putin." Two of them had a laugh, kind of nice. So Bernie came off as very positive in the limited time he had. He also managed to work in an electability argument, and he did so pretty well, because he was talking about some other issue, and then he pivoted just a bit in the middle of the answer to say, people question whether my approach will work. I tell them that it will, because my approach is what people want. He mentioned that 71% of Americans across the board want Medicare for all. He also mentioned that you have to inspire and excite working and poor people. And I think that was an indirect dig at his two major opponents, Warren and Biden. Warren's base is mostly a little wealthier and whiter than most of the party, and Biden's base is not very young, and also a lot of them don't seem to be the kind of people who would be all that politically active, the kind of people who you would need to really inspire, but they might also not show up if they're not inspired. So Bernie was talking about not only winning over the people who can make the party win by motivating the base, but also talking about bringing out independents and people who normally don't bother showing up because there's nothing to vote for. He also talked about unity, but in a way that was far more intelligent than anyone else. He said that if we want unity, it's not about just coming to some neoliberal consensus. We need a progressive agenda that works for all of us. And when we have that agenda laid out, we can all work together for that agenda, and that will create unity. That was a strong answer, and he's absolutely right about how you create unity. You have to show strength, you have to have a vision, and then people have to get behind that vision. You don't start compromising before you try anything. Compromise occurs later. First, you have to lay out a vision and show some leadership, and Bernie made a strong case that he is exactly the guy to do that. So he's in the winner category. I think you could make a legitimate case for him being the winner of the debate, The problem is he just didn't get enough screen time, and CNN, with the way that they structured the debate, made Warren look like the progressive candidate and Sanders look like her assistant. Next up, someone who I did not expect to see in the winner category, but someone who performed way better than I thought possible, Tom Steyer. He got an appropriate amount of speaking time, which is to say not much. If you'll recall, this man literally bought his way into the debate and manipulated the rules of the DNC to get contributions made to his political organization Next Gen Climate or Next Gen America or whatever it's called now to count as support for him as a presidential candidate. And of course, he's a billionaire, so raising money was irrelevant. However, I have to say, in the very limited time he had, he was probably the most efficient and effective speaker on the stage. He said everything that he needed to say to convert some of his AstroTurf support into real support, because you really only need 1 or 2% to stay in the race and to get invited back to the next debate, especially when, as I said, money is not an issue for him. One thing that he did that was probably smart, even though he's been hit for it in a lot of pieces I've read about this debate, is that he tried to claim the issue of impeachment for himself. He tried to take credit for it, and to be fair, he literally started running ads about impeaching Trump around February or so of 2017. So if anyone is going to claim credit, it should be someone who was there from the beginning, and no one has been more in favor of impeachment than Tom Steyer for what that's worth. So I actually am willing to give him credit for that issue because he literally has been calling for it very loudly for a long time. On the issue of the wealth tax, Tom Steyer absolutely stunned me with what he said. Bernie had just talked about the case for it, and then Tom Steyer said, I agree with Bernie Sanders, and then elaborated on it with even more detail. He went into specific details about how the influence of corporations spending money in politics has devastated the working class and gutted unions, and how this has caused the pace of wages to slow down and to become out of whack with the rise in productivity. He even stated something that is very rarely brought up in politics, that if wages had kept pace with production, that the minimum wage would now be worth over $20 and not just $15 an hour. So I was pretty surprised that Tom Steyer came out swinging on economics in that way. He's always been a firebrand on the environment and on a few other issues, but I was stunned that he came out that strong on this issue. On Russia, he said the typical shit about Putin, but then he pivoted to climate change, which otherwise got no mentions, so he has to get some credit for bringing that up. This is another issue he has fought very hard for and spent a lot of money on, by the way. And he said that this will require working with both our allies and our frenemies, so he took a somewhat more adult stance on condemning other countries, because the sort of trend was to condemn this country and that country outright and say you'd never work with them, blah, blah, blah. But Steyer, I think in that sense, had a pretty good answer, because he's talking about a crisis that goes beyond mere national interest. He also talked about breaking up and regulating tech monopolies. I think when he added or regulate, that's what he actually meant. But if you were someone who had never heard him before and you didn't really know his background, you might be forgiven for thinking that he actually wants to break up the tech companies. I'm very doubtful of that myself, however. He also claims that he can expose Trump as a business fraud. He himself started a hedge fund and became a billionaire, and he knows that Trump is not a very good businessman. That is an interesting angle. This is something that I've been fearful of ever since I covered Tom Steyer over a year ago when he was considering running. And I do think that Steyer might try to run as the anti-Trump, and that some Democrats who go for some of those rather weak electability arguments, or the idea of creating sort of a mirror image of Trump, might be persuaded to go with Steyer for that reason. He also did a good job in the last answer of pivoting away to talk about clean water in South Carolina, since the person he named as his unlikely friend was someone who was suffering from bad water in South Carolina. And then he talked about his parents' values, so he's able to work in an introduction of himself and make it a little bit personal, something he didn't have the chance to do at the beginning. So Steyer's performance was very savvy. Now, my hope and also my expectation is that because he is such a late entrant, he won't make much of a difference. And also, since he is trying to play a progressive in a race where people already have their champions, and also where he just maybe lacks credibility because of the way he got into the debate, since progressives tend to pay more attention to that kind of stuff, I think he will have trouble attracting much of a base. That being said, it is possible that people just heard what he said and they were duly impressed because everything that he said sounded great. And if they just heard him speak and they don't look into his background and how he got into these debates, I think that it's possible that Steyer picks up enough of a following to remain around for a while and keep the field crowded and detract a little bit from the real progressive candidates to prevent them from forming the kind of major numbers that they need to pull away. So those are my thoughts on Steyer. I disagree with all the people who say that he clearly lost. If you didn't know who he was and how he got in the debate, you would not call him a loser. You would assume that he was actually a very solid candidate. The Most Improved Debate Performance Award, without a doubt, goes to Julián Castro. In the past, Castro has suffered from having a very wooden speaking style, which is effectively a very terrible Obama impersonation. But over time, he has sort of found his own voice, and rather than trying to attack people like he did in previous debates, this time he tried to make more of a positive argument for what he believes in, and I think that's really what Castro does better. He sounded way better. He came off as at least reasonably engaging, and I think he has finally found his mojo. That being said, it's probably too late to make much of a difference. So, to get into the details of what he did in this debate, he managed to pivot the impeachment question to talk about jobs and graduation rates in Ohio and elsewhere. And he also put impeachment in context of all of the different challenges that we face and how it's merely one of them and it is not some sort of magical solution to all of our problems. I appreciated that a lot. I think that Castro made a solid case there and came across as the adult in the room on the issue because of putting it in its proper context and talking about things that are frankly more important to real people. During the talk on automation, he pivoted away from automation itself to talk about the need to invest, the number of jobs that Ohio has lost under Trump, and the cost of childcare. This answer wasn't great, but at the same time, he did a good job of talking about things people care about. And it wasn't irrelevant, it was just something of a digression. So it might have attracted a few people who weren't listening to the other candidates if they were worried about, say, healthcare, or childcare, excuse me. So I think that he did well to do what he did, even if I would have liked to hear his thoughts on automation. When it came to the wealth tax, he was able to start out with a personal story about growing up poor. I believe he might be the only candidate who legitimately grew up poor on the stage. And then he talked about how he would combine this wealth tax with higher top marginal tax rates and an inheritance tax. So he built on what Sanders and Warren were doing, and I think that he placed himself firmly in the progressive camp. Before, it wasn't entirely clear. He was kind of leaning progressive, but now he sort of seems to be firmly in that camp altogether. He had a weak answer on Syria, which is not surprising since foreign policy tends to be his weak point, as it is so many candidates. And effectively, he went right after Kamala Harris, and he repeated her sentiment that Trump has to go, although he didn't try the cringy dude gotta go shit. So credit where credit's due, but his answer still sucked. On the opioid crisis, he talked about holding executives accountable and then pivoted to add, and also Wall Street. Wall Street got no mentions in this debate, despite the fact that both Warren and Sanders were on the stage, and both of them are in the top 3. So the only mention of Wall Street all night came from Julián Castro, of all people. On the tech monopoly question, he had a weak answer that was not at all clear, and that was probably his worst point of the night. But he did mention wages and how these companies need to pay people fairly. He could have made the point a little more clearly by listing companies like Uber and some of the delivery services which don't pay people who work for them very fairly. But I think he got the point across enough that it's not a bad answer. When it comes to the Supreme Court, he was against the court packing scheme of Pete Buttigieg, and he had a better idea which would involve cycling judges out through the appellate courts. This sounds quite a bit better, and it sounds a lot less partisan and controversial. So I think that his plan, as he described it, sounds pretty good. I'd like to hear more about it. But for the moment, it sounded pretty solid and like a real workable solution. The last question, which, as I said, was not a good one, was framed by talking about how Bush and Ellen were friends and then asked them who their most unlikely friends were. Of all the candidates, he was the only one who responded to some of the prompt about Bush, and he said that Bush needs to be held accountable. He did talk about how we need to be friends with other people who disagree with us, and that's important, yet there are people who need to be held accountable, and he said, and Bush is one of them. So he's the only candidate who explicitly called for George W. Bush being called out as a terrible president, and that is reassuring when it comes to Castro's political instincts and also his political sense and standing. So now I have a great deal more respect for and trust in Julián Castro, since I know that he is not embracing Bush simply because Trump is also bad. And that may be a low bar, but there are a lot of Democrats who can't even meet that. The overall winner of the night, in my opinion, was Elizabeth Warren. Now I have to preface this by saying that she actually did not have the strongest night. If anything, the other three candidates I just talked about, Bernie, Castro, and Steyer, all had better debate performances than Warren if we're talking about how well they performed in the debate itself. That being said, they didn't get nearly as much screen time as Warren, and they did not get attacked the way that Warren did, so they didn't have as many opportunities to make points and to just be there doing things. A lot of it is the framing that CNN provided, and that framing set Elizabeth Warren up for success. If you were someone who was just tuning in and didn't know what was going on this cycle, you would probably think that Warren was the original author of every progressive piece of legislation, pretty much all of which were actually originally pushed by Bernie Sanders. So one thing that she proved that she can do, which I had some doubts about given that she tends not to be a very skilled politician, is that she proved she can keep her head while under fire without any significant help from Bernie Sanders. I think she thought they were going to work as a tag team again, but because of the combination of the moderators and then Bernie not butting in much, she was more or less on her own. I think Bernie may have let her just fight on her own because he wanted her to take some hits so he could, climb back, which would be smart if he did that, or it may just be that he couldn't get a word in edgewise. Either way, though, Warren was forced to fight on her own, and she did a pretty good job. She could have done better. I could have thought of some more sharp responses to a lot of things that she said, but again, to be fair, she was under attack the whole time, and it had to be a very tiring evening for her, since she was literally getting attacked over and over and over and over. However, one thing she did do well was defend Medicare for all, the need for it, and while she did dodge the tax question in a way that got called out several times and that came also as weak and evasive, she did make a case for Medicare for all, which I found to be pretty powerful. Because she talked about how it's devastating to get a bad diagnosis and how you shouldn't have to worry about how to pay for it. You should just focus on getting well. It's a pretty good answer. She wouldn't say she was going to raise taxes, though. And, of course, CNN is the how you going to pay for it network, so they wouldn't let it go, nor would the moderate Democrats let it go. On the issue of automation, she said the real problem is bad trade policy. She's partly right here. Yang tries to pin everything on automation, and that's an oversimplification. However, by just ignoring automation the way that she did, she's also ignoring something which is part of the problem. She said that corporations are calling all the shots and that they're not loyal to American workers or American taxpayers, only their profits. She's 100% right there, and I was very much happy to hear someone finally say this. I've been saying this for my entire life, and it was finally good to hear a presidential candidate say it in exactly the right words. We need more unions, and she says that we need to put 40% of or put on corporate boards there need to be 40% employees, so that way corporations are less likely to screw over their workers or to outsource their jobs. So I felt like she was pretty strong on that point, and she did all of this talking about unions and all that without pandering specifically to Ohio by talking about Chevy cars. So much credit there. On the issue of the wealth tax, she put up a strong defense of this policy, even though I'm pretty sure that she is not nearly as dedicated to it as Bernie. And she said that tax plans show your values. I think she's absolutely correct about that. This is why a lot of times the real debates in Washington occur during the tax debate every year or during the allocations bill. There's a lot of shadow spending, and that's where a lot of people work for the things that they truly want. Which, I mean, they help their donors, of course. And she asked an open question, the way that Bernie had earlier, about why she and Bernie were the only people who were right on this issue. She also pointed out in a kind of throwback to Obama's quote that you didn't build that the billionaires benefited heavily from all of the investments by the public, and that they wouldn't have been able to do what they did without the roads that we built, the schools that we built, and other things, and that as part of the society and people who have done exceptionally well because of the society, billionaires owe us back. So she took the point Obama made, but she made it far, far more persuasively. On the issue of Syria, she said we need to get out of the Middle East and that there are no military solutions to these problems. She was right on the money. Unfortunately, she didn't go into much detail because she is not a very strong foreign policy candidate. When it came to the issue of guns, she got in a bit of a tiff with Amy Klobuchar. Guess who the aggressor was? I'll give you 3 guesses. And she also labeled the filibuster as the tool of the NRA when basically Klobuchar said that we now have a moment to get things done. We shouldn't be pushing for hard stuff. We should go for the easy stuff because we actually have a moment. Warren pointed out we've had a moment for a while. The problem has been the filibuster. Since attacking McConnell is now pretty much standard fare, I think that in the eyes of most voters, Warren came off better in that little exchange. Because Warren was on the screen so much, I actually have to dedicate twice as much time to her. So let's get to more of Elizabeth Warren's performance. On the health question, which was clearly engineered for Bernie and then asked as a courtesy to 2 other people, Warren responded simply, "I have energy," and Aaron Burnett said, "Cool." She was, as I mentioned, allowed to dodge Tulsi Gabbard's question about the fitness to be commander-in-chief. And now that I think about it, since Aaron Burnett was the moderator who was working on both of those questions, if there was a moderator who was totally in the tank for Warren, it was clearly Aaron Burnett. Aaron Burnett did everything in her power, such as it was, to help Elizabeth Warren, and probably made her look a lot better than she otherwise would have. When it came to the issue of tech monopolies, she said that we cannot allow them to dominate our democracy and our economy, and that Amazon is too dominant. She was then followed up by Tom Steyer, who agreed with her, and I think that because she had the billionaire entrepreneur guy backing her up, that it made it seem like her policies were a lot more mainstream, and also that she was correct on the issue if even this billionaire dude who nobody's ever heard of agrees with her. So that actually helped her, I think, just the timing of having Steyer coming after. When it came to the issue of taking money from corporate executives, she said that she's against it. Now, here we need to clarify something. Of course, the reason why she's against it is because she was originally going to do the pivot in the general election and take corporate money, as she said on the Young Turks at one point. But then executives said they're not giving her money and they won't give the Democratic Party any money if she's nominated. So now she can go full progressive. That's why she's taken that stance. So at this point, she probably means it because she feels burned. But if they warm up to her later, I'm not convinced that she wouldn't just go back to taking corporate money. Also, she raised some corporate money before she said she wasn't going to take corporate money. So her credibility on this issue is not great, but no one was going to attack her other than Bernie, and Bernie didn't get to talk. And he also is not attacking her at all at this point. She said something about we need to vote on Roe versus Wade in Congress rather than relying on the Supreme Court to really encapsulate that ruling into the law. The thing is that ruling was made in the early 70s and it still stands. So clearly it's fine the way it is. And also passing an abortion bill through the Congress, it might not be a terrible idea, but it doesn't seem all that necessary, and I don't know why they got so sidetracked on that issue. Booker and Harris talked about it, and then they dragged Warren into it because, of course, she has to be responsible for every issue. She got into that scuffle with Biden over taking credit for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I think she won the scuffle. Anyone who knows anything about that bureau knows that it was literally her idea and that she was the person who brought it to Obama's attention before she was in Congress. So Biden trying to take credit for that was a really dumb move on his part. And of course she won that exchange. She also scuffled with Buttigieg and Klobuchar over the issue of whether we should fight for things or engage in bipartisanship and consensus building. Once again, I think that she won because the stance they took was unbelievably stupid. They thought that you could just get all these things done without having to fight for them, and that we just need to work together and be pleasant with one another, and that's the key, even though they were very aggressive and rude toward Warren all night. So there's a certain irony in talking about how great it is to be civil when you yourself are not civil. She had a decent closer talking about the need to build a campaign that works for all Americans, but what it sounded like was a watered-down version of Bernie Sanders' closer. And if I had to characterize Warren both in terms of her performance tonight and also her campaign as a whole, she's a watered-down Bernie Sanders. That's really what she is. So as for myself, I prefer regular Coke to diet, and I'm going to stick with Bernie. He did enough tonight to earn another donation from me. Warren did a lot better than what she's done in the past, and because she's being forced left, I think I could probably support her if she got nominated. So I'm hoping that she stays left, but I'm also, of course, hoping she doesn't actually win the nomination. So anyway, those are my thoughts, brief as they are, on the debate for the Democrats, the fourth debate. So that's all I've got to say. I'm just going to end this video now. I'm Thersites the Historian. Use my Brave browser link and go to Patreon and give me all of your money. Thank you very much.